So this is September 7th, update to Hyper and Hyper Cloud. Got a short update and then we'll pass around the room. I've been working on a project called Hyper Test, which is an end-to-end test script for all the Hyper services. And it will be a CLI application. You can give it an endpoint and it will pull the list of services from that endpoint and then run full end-to-end tests for those services. So it'll really help us validate adapters. And the nice thing about it is it tests it tests everything. It tests all the features of a given API and will be made more robust over time, but it tests both happy and sad paths, tests all kinds of options, like for querying or listing documents. One bug was resolved where I think, Casey, you entered it in about descending not working. It's got a test for that to confirm that. So now it will just make all of our adapters be more compliant, and we'll have a lot of confidence that they're doing everything that the specs are asking them to do. And then the other thing that I'm working on, and I think is pretty exciting, is Hyper Connect. I think we have a pretty solid API kind of DSL, and we actually took the tact of it returning a request object. And with the fetch API, you can take a request, you can pass either a string of a URL to the fetch call or a request object. So what this allows us to do is build the request object inside the connector library and then just return it back. And then the user of that connect object can extend it to whatever they want if they want to. So it really comes together as kind of this nice kind of primitive that you can build on. You can either just call fetch, or if you wanted to call your own version of a fetch command or use Axios or other things, you can do that. You don't have to just use fetch or like the basic fetch. So that's pretty cool, and it gives you kind of this IntelliSense type ahead completion. So, you know, it'd be client.data.query or client.data.create kind of nomenclature. So anyway, those are the two projects I'm working on. I think I should have them ready to start to use, you know, in the next couple of weeks, if not sooner. I've been able to verify 2 data adapters and 2 cache adapters with Hypertest so far, and I'm jumping on search, and then I have storage and queue. And as I do those, I'm building out the connect and the test. We're also working on Hyper Cloud, and I'll let Tyler talk to that. If Tyler, if you want to spend a few minutes talking about the Hyper Cloud dashboard and where we're at.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, to what Tom was talking about, I pulled in some of the code that he wrote for the Hyper Connect, and I'm using it as part of Hyper Cloud to connect to cloud.hyper to persist all of our data. Right now, like Tom said, there's only the data and the cache APIs are implemented, but it feels really good. It's really, really nice to use. So that's been a nice experience so far. So just trying to dog food that a little bit pretty early on. And if I have any feedback for you, Tom, I'll let you know. In terms of HyperCloud, we've made some really good progress. We now have HyperCloud placing all of its data inside of cloud.hyper. So that's a bit confusing, but basically we are dog fooding cloud.hyper to build out the HyperCloud dashboard. So the HyperCloud dashboard has its own application inside of cloud.hyper, and that's so it's and we've set up the zero touch dev environment inside of Gitpod to where when you spin up a branch, you check out anything on your Gitpod, it will automatically bootstrap the HyperCloud application within cloud.hyper and spin up all those services. It will seed it with a bunch of stub data that we've been using. And then it just hooks everything together and hooks together the dashboard with the locally deployed Hyper application. And it's been really nice so far. So I can just check out any branch and just start plugging away and coding away, and it feels really good.
Nice.
In terms of feature work, we are just chugging right along. I just got the create account mutation working inside of HyperCloud. Everything's being sourced from Hyper now in terms of our queries exposed through our graph. We're using GraphQL on the back end of HyperCloud, and we've started to implement all of the mutations now. And I have the happy path for create account, which goes and given like a name and an email, it'll go and create the account in Hyper. It'll go and create the Stripe customer account, and then it will go and update the document inside of Hyper. And there's a bit of boilerplate that had to be put in place for that. But with all of that in place, the rest of these mutations around like creating new teams and creating new applications, those will be spun up much more quickly, I think. So making good progress. We're still trying to sort of stick to the trying to keep our code as functional as possible, heavily using those algebraic data types from Crocs where we can, and just trying to keep everything nice and composable. So that's been fun, but making really good progress there. I know Trip has made a lot of progress on the front end, but I can't speak specifically to all the work that he's done. I know he's put together the form. Right now, he's currently working on docs for HyperCloud that will be hosted in archbee, and he's using like the markdown approach, so we can keep all of our docs under version control and just deploy those directly from the repo, which will just all by presumably just CI, which will be really nice.
Yeah, that'll be cool. That's also on my list to convert our Hyper docs to the Git archbee kind of thing. So I'll be excited to hear how painful that was. Hopefully it's not too bad.
Yeah, it looks like, from what I can tell on Trips, on the code that Trip's been merging, it looks like he's getting a lot of that documentation done pretty quickly. So
Cool.
it's looking good so far.
Very cool.
In terms of the Hyper Connect, as we talked about earlier today, we did find one issue with the Vercel fetch, sort of opinionated library, which kind of wraps fetch. Unfortunately, it doesn't accept a request object like the vanilla fetch does. So hopefully, I've put in an issue with them as a sort of feature request / is this sort of thing going to be supported? But keeping our finger on the pulse there. Maybe we can, maybe if they're open to a PR, we can push out something there and make that library better, closer to vanilla fetch API.
Yeah, yeah, that'll be great if they can do that, because yeah, it's a nice wraparound fetch with the built-in retries and the DNS caching. So hopefully it won't be something that's hard to do. Cool. And then the other kind of side note has been working with Casey on, and Tyler, you've looked at it too, is on kind of a contract approach to building out adapters. And I think we're pretty close with that approach. And hopefully next update we'll have something ready. But Casey, any updates from your end that you want to share on that experience? You feel like we're getting close to like a really well-defined kind of contract and statement of work?
Yeah, I think getting close, as you're aware, as we've talked about. But it's kind of hard to find the lines, like, well, you got open source software you're making. What's all the challenges of doing open source, but having it, I guess, sort of proprietary open source. I don't know how else to describe it. But yeah, no, I think we're getting close.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things that was huge, is important for me, is to be able to fund open source and try to come up with a structure. And I don't know if this is the best approach, but it's currently the best we got. I did look at some things some other folks are doing, is essentially offering grants. But I don't have a lot of experience with grants and how those work. I'm just more accustomed to kind of contract development work. So and the one challenge with contract is really, you have to have language in there that covers a very broad area. And with open source, a lot of the, like a non-disclosure, right? If you've ever looked at a non-disclosure agreement, it's not to disclose anything that's IP related. Well, with open source, you shouldn't have anything that's a trade secret or anything like that. So it shouldn't be an issue. But do you take that out or not? Kind of thing. Do you, just because it shouldn't doesn't mean that it can't. And those are kind of the hard questions to answer. And same thing with non-compete. And that's a difficult question to answer. But our open source is Apache 2, but I think we want to figure out how to contract developers and pay them to build adapters, but also they shouldn't, I don't think we want them to start their own hyper kind of company and compete with us, or do we care? Those are questions to think about and answer. So that's, anyway, there's non-compete, non-disclosure, and then kind of, governance with, I'll do X for X amount of money, and have that statement of work clear and concise. So I'm trying to just nail all that down, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think a lot of the way that we license the work that's produced, or maybe if they're already like working on a like they're fixing a bug in a pre-existing like adapter or something like that, or adding a new feature to an existing adapter, it's the license will be important. But in terms of if it's like something brand new, I guess it's there's some nuance there that frankly I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not exactly sure how to go about all of that.
Yeah, it's just getting the language right, so both parties feel comfortable, and I think I think we're close on that. Last round, I think Casey indicated that he's pretty close with where we're at with the current document, and I just want to make sure that we have something that's not a very reusable contract, so that we can invest time in creating one document and reuse it versus creating a contract for every single case. And so we're working towards that. But I think from the kind of the statement of work or the requirements document, I think that we're pretty good with that. There's a couple little adjustments, Tyler, that you recommended. But overall, I think from what Casey said, that you felt like that was pretty clear of the ask. So yeah, so I'm pretty pumped about getting that over the finish line. And I think with the hyper test and that document, if it's a adapter that we've got a set of tests for, it'll be very easy to validate implementations. So
Hypertest will be a game changer for that. If I mean that's the majority of what the tests are, that the adapter developer would be writing would be sort of covered in that use case.
Yep.
What are you thinking as far as, would the developer of the adapter at that point basically be just testing almost more like unit type stuff, or would they still be doing more internal tests of their services? Like, what are you thinking there?
Yeah, so with what I've played with so far, I would be really comfortable moving towards more of a unit test approach and then running hyper test in the CI. But I think we have to go through kind of two steps. I think one is I want to get all the services kind of tested through hyper test, and then circle back and get Trip and Tyler to kind of review it and basically say, well, we need to add this test and this test and this test, and just do an iteration just to get a second pair of eyes on it. But I think at that point, yes, I think that if we feel comfortable after a pretty thorough review or audit, that we could say, and I'd love to say is if hyper test passes your adapter, then that's immediately a V1 stamp, right? You should be able to stamp that as a version 1. So that's where I would like to be. I think we just have to make sure that we're all confident in hypertest to be that, and once we are, I think that would be totally fine with me. I'm like, as long as the tests are covering the code, and if hypertest does a really good job of that coverage, then I would only write unit tests for adapters and use hypertest to test the implementation.
Very cool.
Yeah, I think a lot of adapters will have with the addition of hypertest. I think a lot of adapters will have very small like test footprints. The ones that I think will be larger and have sort of might have more unit tests. And I agree with what Tom was saying as far as what most of the tests that a developer is going to be writing is specific to their implementation or any sort of utilities they build out their adapter. But I could see adapters for the data port where they have to implement like the query API. That might be something that developers might have more unit tests for. But again, like I think hypertest will try and hit all of like the big parts of that query API as much as it can, just to give developers more confidence, and then they just have to worry about the little parts of their specific implementation. But I suspect that most of like it's going to hypertest would drastically decrease the amount of tests that a developer would need to write, because hypertest, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, it tests the adapter as just a black box. It mounts it on a hyper instance and then just consumes hyper. And so it's testing like a full like integration test with like a hyper router or the hyper application, and like what goes into it and what goes out of it. So that's also going to flow through Zod. So it's going to validate the inputs and outputs as well. So it's doing a lot.
You're muted, Tom.
Yeah, speaking for me, it really, once I got both the Mongo and the DNDB adapters passing, I had a lot of confidence in both of those implementations because it is going end to end. There's the nice thing is we're going to continually to add to hypertest, but what I think is really cool about it is we add it once and then all the adapters get that robust test. So if we add additional query test to try to do ors and ands and all of that, we add it once and then we can run it against all of our adapters and have a high degree of confidence that they're all good.
Yeah, it's such a huge boon for development, because if we add a new feature to a service, we start by writing the test and hypertest and then let it fail against all the adapters. And then we can just, those could either be like bounties, like following that course contract that you and Casey have been working on, or it's just like something that the core team manages if there are certain core adapters that we want to tackle new features. And then and something as a separate note, something that Casey had brought up when he was building out the DynamoDB adapter was just figuring out how to hook it into Hyper. And he was kind of like, and correct me if I'm misremembering, Casey, what you were like requiring sort of bits and pieces from other parts of the repo just to get it mounted, just so you could test it through the Hyper API as described in the Hyper docs. And so with the Hyper test, it does all that mounting for you. And so it's just another detail you don't have to worry about.
Yep. Yeah. And I think, yeah. And again, this is probably 3 steps down, but I think we can take the template, the adapter template, and we have the harness in there that runs Hyper. Then we can kind of attach hypertest to that template. So when you start to build an adapter out of the gate, you've got hypertest ready to rock. So I think that's what's really exciting, because we're moving from a process like Casey, when you first started, that it was completely cumbersome, and having to go all these places to tie all the bits together, to probably by the end of the year, a very frictionless process where literally you fork the adapter template, spin it up in GitHub, and start writing your implementation and start running hypertest against that. And then when all the tests pass, your implementation is complete and you can ship it. And that's really exciting, because then the only barrier is really the actual service you're implementing.
Yeah, that's the single biggest, I would say, individual, like most significant individual technical change that I can think of from the perspective of an adapter developer. That'll not only solve a lot of the setup problems, but it'll also resolve a lot of the ambiguity of, well, I think I implemented what you're trying to say, but I'm not really sure. I think it will, I think it'll make that just in general way, way easier and way, way faster. So very excited about that.
Yep. Yay. And, we still have to have our work cut out with plugins, but I think hypertest can help test those as well. Because it is, you could isolate a plugin that does a specific thing and essentially do it like an adapter kind of template, and ship a plugin. So Trip, thanks for joining. You got any updates for us from the document side? Tyler said you were working on doing markdown documents with archbee. How's that going?
I've started putting markdown documents in a branch. Just trying to hit some of the major questions someone would have about the things they may find in the UI, and just it's mainly low hanging fruit right now. Just keep myself busy. So it's going well. It's in my current branch. Posted to it a few times today. Sorry I'm late. I'm having a conversation with the wife. Lost track of time.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm late. I apologize. But yeah, I would say overall it's going well. It would be nice to, next steps as far as documentation is, I would think that we want to start to revisit strategies around what technical bits we want to document, what kind of examples, samples that we want, like just going through hypercloud under that, and just kind of detaching ourselves from the open source, and just do it solely from the perspective of hypercloud with the getting keys and connection strings, and doing some manual orchestration of services. Just try to get them up and running. And I was also thinking about doing some, I've started to add some contextual places within the UI, like the question mark icons that you can click on that will go to the eventual docs. Right now they're pointing to the open source docs, but they'll switch over to this new hypercloud docs. But I was thinking about having contextual menus pop up there, so you could like see a code sample or read more about it or view a related blog post and things like that. But not scope creeping it, but just trying to get people up to speed.
Yep.
And consumable small bits.
Nice. And the archbee piece isn't Is it pretty straightforward with the Git kind of
I
integration?
haven't hooked it up to Git yet. It doesn't look like it's behaving today.
Okay.
The CSS looks like it's not getting downloaded from the site, and the
Okay.
link to that Git integration piece was not available. So it looks like they're having some tough Monday after Labor Day.
Got it. All right. Sounds good. Hopefully they'll get it resolved soon. And yeah, so that's all that I have. We are going to be, we're going to have a booth at All Things Open in October. We're heading October 17th through the 19th. So that's exciting. And we'll be giving a talk there. And I think it'll be a really cool conference. So that's the only other note. We're trying to have something to show by then. So. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining and providing an update, and talk in about 4 more weeks. See
Thanks,
ya.
everyone.
Thanks.